It's a California legend. Some young actor or young actress takes a bus to the Golden State, and then they get discovered by some mega producer or famous director. And suddenly they're cast in tons of films and they have more wealth and fame than they ever could have imagined before. And we look at someone who lived that story and we say to ourselves, that's a good life. But is it? Is it a good life? Because a number of celebrities have actually gone on record in a very candid way by saying, like, they're kind of miserable even with all their wealth and their fame. Jesus once said that if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. What did he mean by that? The first Christians understood that their happiness and a life of fulfillment wasn't tied to wealth and to fame, rather to understanding there are separate lessons you have to learn at different stages of life in order to give your life away. So let's explore what those lessons are, and let's discover what it actually looks like to live a good life.
Good morning. So I was probably about 32 years old, something like that. And I got a gift card that I could use on anything. It was an Amazon gift card. And so I went on the Amazon website and I found some stuff that I was really excited about. And I ordered it and I had it shipped to our house. And my wife was there when the box came from UPS. And so she put it on the table and opened it up. And I got home a little bit later and she had the box open and she looked at me and she looked at the box and she looked at me and she looked at the box. She held the box toward me and she said, "Is this what you used your birthday gift card for?" And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "This is a box of socks." And I was like, "Yeah." I was really excited about socks. Why? I was getting older. And suddenly I wanted really good socks. Like, there are these moments in our lives where we look back and we're like, oh, that's when I got old. That's the moment right there. A little bit before that, I'd gone to see the movie Transformers. Michael Bay, the director Michael Bay, had made a Transformers film, and I remember watching it, and about 3/4 of the way through, I was like, I think this is the worst movie I've seen this year. Like, I wasn't enjoying it at all. The movie ends, the credits roll, and I'm with 5 or 6 other friends, and they all look at each other, and they're like, that was awesome. And I was like, oh no, I'm getting old, right? Like, there are these moments that you have, you're just like, oh, I am getting old, and you just kind of know it. This last summer, I was in Montana, and I was fly fishing with some friends of mine, and we had hired this guide, and this guide was with us, and all the guides were young, and they do fly fishing all the time, and we are terrible fishers, so it's great to have people there. And this young guide looked at me and one of my friends, and he said, so what's one of your favorite bands? And I said, one of my favorite bands is U2, the band U2, you know? And he said, why is it that, and I said, and he stopped. And I said, were you about to ask, why is it that old guys always like U2? Yeah, that's exactly what he was about to ask. And the reason is because, right, it's the same reason that really old guys like the Beatles. They changed music forever. We're not going to get off on that topic. Anyway, so that's kind of like there are these moments in your life where you go like, oh, I'm getting old. But just because you're getting old doesn't mean you're becoming an elder. You can be a young person with an old soul. Or you can be an old person with fresh ideas. Or you can be an old person and an old fart. The choice is up to you. Those are all possibilities and all kinds of spectrum between one and the other, right? That's the journey. Those are the choices you get to make. So we're in this series called The Good Life. What we want to really talk about is what does it look like to live a good life? We're at different parts of our life as we age. We actually learn the lessons we need to in order to do well and to move forward and to help other people around us. Last week, we talked about this in terms of kind of like the two halves of life. We talked about it as being like the two mountains. The first mountain, we said last week, is the one you climb usually when you're younger. It's the one that the world tells you to climb. It's the one that everybody around you, your culture will tell you is important. This is where you establish an identity and leave your parents and cultivate your talents and you try to build a secure ego and you make your mark. And so you go out in the world and you think that life is all about these things. And if you can just do these things, then you will have succeeded at life. But at some point in your life, something will come along, some set of circumstances, someone who does something to you, some suffering you experience, and it will knock you off this first mountain. And it's when you're in the valley there that you have to decide if you're going to just keep climbing this mountain over and over and over again, or if in fact there might be a better mountain to climb. And that's when you might move toward the second mountain. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with this as your starting place. In fact, you have to do this first before you can do that. Almost always, you have to do this first before you can do that. The second mountain is about checking your ego. It becomes less materialistic. It's more others-oriented instead of self-oriented. It clashes with culture because culture values will tell you to do all that stuff. And the second mountain says, actually, it's more about giving your life away to other people. And then it's almost unoffendable. Like, it's just really secure in who it is. So when someone else comes along and is like, I don't like that idea, I don't agree with that, I don't like it doesn't lose its mind because it's safe and secure in who it is. That's the second mountain. And so last week we talked about, well, how do you go from the first to the second mountain? What does that look like? And we said that for everybody, this is the thing that you go through. These are the 3 steps. There's no way around it. And you'll actually do this over and over again in your life. You'll have order, and then you'll have disorder, and then you will reorder the disorder. That's the way that you grow. That's how you go from the first mountain to the second mountain. In other words, last week we talked a lot about order. These are kind of like the building blocks that hopefully your parents or your grandparents or a teacher, a mentor, or someone when you were young handed you. And we looked at some of what those were last week, the kinds of like basic starting place you need to build a strong ego, because you have to have an ego in order to eventually get past it. And so hopefully when you were a kid, someone told you that you mattered, that you were special. Hopefully when you were a kid, someone taught you the importance of family and community. Hopefully when you were a kid, you started to think about yourself mattering, but also about other people mattering. But as you get older, you'll start to realize that some of the ideas you were handed as a kid actually don't work for you as an adult. And the faith tradition or the moral compass that you were handed as a child may not be strong enough to withstand the weight of your adult questions and your adult experiences. So what do you do when that happens? Well, you start to experience disorder. And that's what we're going to talk about today. All the rest of today, we're going to talk about disorder. What does it look like when the order you were handed turns out it doesn't work for you? And this is I think, I had a really long version of this message, and then I whittled it down for the first hour, and it turns out I was still too long. So I've whittled it down even more. We could say so much about this, but hopefully hang in there with me today, because this matters a lot. And especially if you're over the age of, say, 25, 30, like you're moving into an area of your life where if you haven't already, this is right around the corner for you. Some stuff that you thought was really solid is going to start feeling like shifting sand at some point pretty soon. And what you do with that is going to matter a lot. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 16. We actually read this verse last week, but I want to take more time to unpack it today. 16, starting with verse 24, Jesus says this to his disciples. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. All right, so first thing you have to do is give up your own way. This is kind of that first half of life stuff. Like, this is where I'm in it for me, I'm looking out for me, I'm number one, I'm trying to build around me. Like, that's your own way. That's the way all of us start off life. We can't help it, of course. Like, that's the beginning part. There has to be some kind of like self-defense mechanism where you are trying to like look out for you. Yes, that's the beginning. But if you stop there, you're going to miss out on most of what God has in store for you. So Jesus says, like, there's a way that seems good to you, and that's the way you're headed, and that's also the way you'll have to give up. At some point in your life, you'll have to lay that down. And how do you do that? Well, you're going to have to take up your cross. What? In the first century, crosses were killing devices. They were a symbol for suffering and death. And what most commentators agree that Jesus is saying here is that at some point in your life, you are going to face suffering and death, your own and other people's. And see, this is the thing that all the religious traditions in the history of the world really seem to agree on, that life is full of suffering. And unfortunately, over the years, I've heard a number of sermons from different pastors that sometimes make it sound like, well, if you'll just come forward and accept Jesus, if you'll just choose to put your trust in him, then kind of all your problems will go away. And again, that's not usually explicitly stated, but it seems to be implied sometimes that like following after Jesus just kind of makes your life, like your problems kind of dissipate. And I just want to go on record as saying, it's absolutely not true. If you follow after Jesus, there's a chance even that your life will feel more problematic for a while, because compared to his teachings, you'll realize what an absolute shambles your life is in now. Like, it won't make all of your problems go away. It will not put an end to your suffering. That's never been what Christianity is all about. And here's the problem. If you think that it is, then when you put your trust in Jesus and suddenly you suffer, like sometime later, weeks, months, days, years, you'll think that you were sold a false bill of goods. But Jesus never said we wouldn't have trouble. In fact, he literally said we would. In this world, you will have trouble, he said, but take heart, I have overcome the world. In other words, it's not to downplay your suffering. It's not to say that it won't exist. It's just to say, I've overcome this stuff. And through me, you can too. And it doesn't mean your circumstances right now will change and be totally, totally good and better. It means that you can redefine what that means for you, how you interact with it, and what it means for the way that you live your life through Jesus. That's the invitation Jesus says. So, look, take up your cross, all the suffering, all the death, all the stuff that you'll face, take it. And do what with it? Follow me. And this is the most important part. Because here's the thing, you will suffer. You will have periods, long stretches of life sometimes perhaps, where life seems to be very difficult, very challenging, where you're not sure the way forward. So you can sit in the midst of that, or you can try to deny it, pretend that it's not happening, pretend that you're fine. How many of us have known someone, or maybe we've been someone at one point, where we got deeply hurt by something, and our first go-to is to try to pretend like it didn't hurt that much. Oh, it's okay. I'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Like, that tends to be a go-to sometimes. And what Jesus says is, like, look, take up your cross. Like, that suffering, yeah, acknowledge it. Pick it up, like, live in it. But here's what you do with it. Follow me. Follow me with it. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But paradoxically, if you give your life up for my sake, you will save it. Another way, perhaps, of saying this is, I just think one of the most important spiritual lessons you can ever learn in your life. The way down is the way up. You want to become a better person? You want to find out what you're really made of, what God really created you for? You want to follow after Jesus wholeheartedly, be changed and transformed? You just need to know, like, the way down is the way up. If you're going to head up and become more Christ-like, it's probably going to be because you descended into the depths first and you suffered, or you experienced pain, or you really confronted who you really are. And the way down is the way up. We see this, by the way, in any, like, you go through the scripture, any Bible character you point to, Moses, Peter, James, like, you will see that they go through this same thing where, like, their life was ordered, and then it got disordered by some experience they had, and then God reordered it around him, around Jesus Christ. Like, that's the pattern. It's always the pattern. But by the way, we hate this. Why? Because no one gladly chooses to just run toward suffering, to run toward pain, to run toward agony. And yet, after the suffering, after the pain, after the agony, most of us will point back to those moments as the most formative moments of our lives. If I were to ask you, like, hey, what was the thing that really transformed you for the good in your life? Like, what were a couple things that really pointed you to? Probably none of you would be like, man, there was this time I bought this bass boat, and we went fishing. Like, that's not the thing that would come to your mind, right? Or, yeah, for me, it was definitely when the Rams won the Super Bowl. I mean, that was the day I was like, I've arrived. I'm a human being wonderfully created by God, and this is who I am, a Rams fan. Like, that's not what you would say. Those were probably great days, by the way. What you'd say is something like, let me tell you about the time I got divorced. Let me tell you what walking through that did to me and for me. Or let me tell you about the time my father passed away. And I hadn't forgiven him for this or that, and I was just sitting there in my anger, my grief, and I wasn't sure that there was going to be a way out of it. Let me tell you how I got out of it. Like, we always point back to the suffering as the things that formed us the most, because the way down is the way up. By the way, I kind of hate that that's the case, and yet it's the case. Richard Rohr, who we looked at last week, he says this: the human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling or changing or dying. The ego is that part of us that loves the status quo even when it is not working. It attaches to past and present, and it fears the future. How many of us have, either ourselves or we know someone who has, at some point in your life, like, you keep doing the same harmful thing, whether it's to you or to others, like, over and over and over again, because it's easier to just keep doing the same thing over and over again than it is to change and actually shift that harmful behavior. Like, the ego struggles with change and transformation. So today, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the kinds of ways that things fall apart for us, that we enter into some type of suffering, and how that ends up transforming us. I'm going to give a few personal examples. I'm going to give a few examples from the lives of people that I've known. I just find yourself in this, because I assure you, even if you've never been through exactly the kind of thing that I'm going to point to, there's probably something in your life that you can point to that would be similar. All right, so here's a few ways that things fall apart. First of all, unmet expectations. This is a huge one. We start off our life and we have expectations of exactly what life is going to be like, or what a thing is going to be like that we enter into or that we participate in, and then it's not like that at all, and we are left disappointed and disillusioned. My wife and I have been married for a couple decades now, and we got married when we were pretty young. And when we got married, when you're in your 20s, you don't even know who you are. You certainly don't know who they are, right? So you're both like selling each other constantly on the great person that you'd like for them to believe that you are, only to find out later, much to your surprise, they're not as great as you thought they were, and you're not nearly as great as you thought you were, right? Oh, we have a lot of work to do here. First few months of marriage, we discovered that my wife, Emily, had dormant obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder oftentimes doesn't show itself unless you have a lot of stress in your life. And within a span of a few months, she had started a new college, started a new major, married me, moved in with a boy. I mean, you can see how this would be stressful, right? There's just a lot going on here that you never had to deal with before. Now you have to deal with all of it. And so she was struggling so much, like she would just have stuff running through her mind. I don't have time to get into all the details today. We'll probably share the story with you in greater detail at some point. But she'd have stuff running through her mind that would take her out of conversations. She couldn't be present because of all the stuff that she was thinking through constantly. And she was telling me about it and what that looked like. And my great advice was, well, stop doing that. Because she hadn't been diagnosed, we didn't know. I was just like, well, you know that's crazy. Like, you shouldn't do that. You know that that's not logical. And she's like, yeah, I know that's not logical. Well, you shouldn't do that. Well, I can't stop. Well, why? Have you ever had a song stuck in your head, and like you don't even like the song, but it just won't go away? Random example, it's a small, small world, it's a small, small world, right? Or our staff did this ridiculous over-the-top Christmas rap for our Christmas services here. It was one of the worst things that's ever been recorded in the history of the world, and that song has been stuck in my head for weeks now. I hate it. So, like, have you ever had a song stuck in your head, and like you don't want it there, but it's there? That's the kind of thing she was wrestling with the obsessive-compulsive thoughts. She didn't want them there. She wasn't saying that they were logical, but she just couldn't get them out. So we ended up seeing a therapist, and we ended up like that being very, very helpful for us. But at some point early on in that process, before we knew what it was or what was going on, I just remember like feeling like I need to get on my knees before God and commit to this marriage now, because it's not looking, we're just a couple months in and it does not look like I thought it would. And I don't know what this will mean for, how healthy our relationship can be or whether we can have kids or any of that kind of stuff. I didn't understand what was happening in her head. And, eventually she got a lot of things reframed for her by an amazing therapist in Texas. I forget the name of the town now. And that was super helpful. And then she was on medication for some time, and then she got off of that a few years later. And she's learned how to totally control it. And, when we first were telling our friends about it, we were like, well, she got diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And our friends would be like, oh, well, that's great. At least the house will be clean, right? And it's like, well, it's not that kind of OCD, unfortunately, right? There's no real upside to this type of OCD. It's all downside. So she worked through that amazingly. And she's such a great wife, and she's such a great mom, and she's such a great employee, and she's such a great follower of Jesus. And I'm so proud of her. And I'm so thankful for the marriage that we have. But starting off, unmet expectations. What even is this? And it takes the thing that felt so ordered and so understandable, and it just blows it up. Total disorder. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? Perhaps there's been something in your life that you thought it would go this way, but it didn't. And you're left sitting in the wreckage, trying to figure out what went wrong and what to do next. And it's so challenging. And if you're sitting in the disorder, I just want you to know that like better days can come. But yeah, there's an uncomfortability to this right now. But the way down is the way up. Another way that things fall apart is seeing our shadow. Here's what I mean by this. You'll hear a lot of therapists and a lot of spiritual leaders talk about this idea of the shadow self. The shadow self is the version of yourself that you project to others, that you want them to think is the real you, and that you sometimes convince yourself is the real you, but is not in fact the full real you. Are you with me? That's the shadow self, okay? So it's, when you go on a first date, you're just all shadow, basically, okay? You're just projecting. When you are new at a company, right? You just start a new job. You're trying to project the very best version of yourself. It's not that there's no truth to it whatsoever. It's just that it's not the full you. And at some point in your life, you're going to be confronted with your own actual darkness. At some point in your life, you're going to realize, like, oh, there are things about me that I wish were different. And then you'll have to decide whether you're going to invite God in to help you work through those things, or whether you're going to ignore them or move forward. I worked with someone for a few years when I was in Pennsylvania who loved Jesus, loved his family, loved his church. In so many ways, he was a good man. But he had a temper problem, and he was just highly irritable. And I remember calling him out one day, like we'd had a staff meeting, and he was just really bad in the staff meeting. And he was older than me, right? And so there's a little bit of an intimidation factor of like, I mean, who am I to tell this guy anything? But like, it was an unhealthy like dynamic. So staff meeting ended, everybody left, and I asked him to stick around a little bit. And I was like, hey, the thing you said and the way that you said it, like that was just really unhealthy dynamic. Like, what's going on with you? And he was really honest with me, and I super appreciate it. He said, I don't know why I'm like that. I wish I wasn't. And he had never done the work to really, like, why am I so bristly like that? Why am I so short-tempered like that? Why do I burst out in those things? Like because at some point you have to identify your shortcomings in order to actually hope for Jesus to transform them. And finding out where you are missing those pieces is incredibly, incredibly helpful. But it also upends your life. Because if you're going to name your own shortcomings, you'll have to realize you are not as good as the shadow you project. You are not as great as your Instagram profile. You know, your life is not as happy as it seems like in your TikTok videos. At some point, you have to recognize, like, there's stuff here that needs work and that disorders you. So things fall apart, unmet expectations, seeing our shadow. By the way, the seeing our shadow thing, you do this work on yourself, but not by yourself, okay? Because you don't actually know what other people's experience of you is. And you need a mirror. You need someone who's around you. I heard a pastor say one time, and I've remembered it ever since. Really helpful. He says, you should ask people who are close to you in your life, you should ask them this very simple question. What's it like to be on the other side of me? Okay, I know it rhymes, so it's a cheesy pastor thing, but it's still helpful. What's it like to be on the other side of me? Because here's the thing, you don't know that. But here's the thing that you also don't know. You do stuff all the time that irritates the people you love the most. And they would love the opportunity to tell you about it. So if you just ask them the question, what's it like to be on the other side of me? Like seriously, like what are the things I do that aren't helpful? What are the things I do that when I start, you're like, oh boy, here we go again, right? Like that's, like you can't know that probably, but other people who you love and trust will know that. But this is important. You need to love and trust them. Because you need a mirror, but don't use a fat mirror, right? You remember those funhouse mirrors where your head can look huge, or your waist can look huge, or your bottom can look huge, or whatever? Like, there are people who you know a little bit, and they know you a little bit, and they have all kinds of assumptions about who you are and what's irritating about you and all that kind of stuff, but they don't actually know you that well. So they may give you opinions all day long about your shortcomings or what you need to do better, and those opinions are not worth the paper they would write them down on, okay? Like don't use a fat mirror. Find someone who actually knows you, who would actually willing to like do life with you for a bit, spend time with you. Like that's the mirror you need. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that the church is so helpful for people. Like the Church of Jesus for 2,000 years has been helpful because it takes all these people with all these shortcomings, all of us, right? Gathers us together and we do life together and we try to impact the world for the sake of the gospel together. And we need other people who have that same heart and that same drive to look at us and say like, man, here's what I see God doing in your life. Man, here's why you are remarkable and uniquely and wonderfully made. Also, here are the opportunities you have to grow and become more Christ-like. I see these areas in your life that concern me. That's the beauty of the church. And having the vulnerability to allow somebody past the shadow self to really see who we are in our interior, that's important. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that we really want people to go through Rooted if you haven't before, because it takes a group of people and you walk through the scriptures together and you get to know each other and you care for each other and pray for each other and root for each other. Not why it's called Rooted, but also good. I just realized that. That's great. So you root for each other over the course of 10 weeks. And so if you haven't done this yet, you need a mirror. And this is a great way to get one for other people to speak into your life because, again, you do this work on yourself, but you don't do it by yourself. All right, so unmet expectations, seeing our shadow. Here's another way things fall apart. Tragedy and suffering. Some of you have experienced the worst kind of tragedy. You've lost a loved one, or you've battled cancer, or you've lost a promising career that for maybe years was like what you poured all of your blood, sweat, and tears into. And then something happened. Maybe it was out of your control. Maybe it wasn't. But whatever it was that you loved about your life before, it got totally derailed. And you're still living in the wreckage of that outcome. Some of you, I mean, we have several families in our church who at some point lost one of their children. One of the most tragic things I can possibly imagine. At some point, whatever tragedy you've walked through, you've probably realized, and if you haven't realized yet, hopefully you can realize it today, that as you pick up that cross and carry it, it'll either make you bitter or it'll make you better. You'll either become the kind of person that's more cynical and less likely to trust and less likely to let people in because you don't want to be hurt, or you'll become the kind of person that takes that cross and follows Jesus and becomes more loving and more gracious and recognizes that your life is more of a gift and that it's more fragile than you ever hoped it would be, and in some ways more beautiful because of it. It'll make you bitter or it'll make you better, and you'll have to determine which path you choose. Tragedy and suffering. Here's another way things fall apart. Betrayal. At some point in your life, someone will betray you. It could be a close friend that you have that you thought we're best buds, and then you find out that what they say about you behind your back is not what they say about you to your face. And that just feels like, wow, I thought I had this standing, but we don't. Some of you have experienced infidelity. You've had the person that you stood across from on your wedding day and pledged to be faithful to you, and you pledged to be faithful to them. They haven't been faithful to you. And what you'll find in almost every case when you talk to folks that infidelity has been the choice that they've made is that there's a lot going on there, right? Our immediate thought is usually like, well, they didn't find me good enough or me attractive enough, or our marriage wasn't good enough, or that kind of, and that, maybe some of that plays into it sometimes, but oftentimes what you will find is someone is struggling, they're broken on the inside, and they're looking for affirmation somewhere else. There's first half of life ego issues that usually need to be worked out. And because that order didn't ever happen, the disorder became the way that they lived their life, and they ended up having that affair. Like some of you have been betrayed by the person you thought was least likely to betray you, and that's just a scar that you walk with for the rest of your life. Some of you have seen things fall apart when your belief has been challenged, right? You've believed a certain way. So if you're a follower of Jesus, maybe you believe certain things about Christianity or certain things about the Bible. And then you started to study it more, and then you were less sure about what you believed. I started off, just as a quick example, I started off in a really great church that I'm very thankful for. And, and I don't see things the same way that I did when I was in that church, or that church probably still sees things, but that doesn't mean it wasn't helpful and valuable for me. It was. That church really helped me climb that first mountain. It gave me some order in my life and a starting place with faith. And as I got older, right, my childhood faith wasn't strong enough to withstand the weight of my adult questions. And so the way I thought about Scripture and the way I thought about Christianity, that shifted and changed. It necessarily had to. But that doesn't mean that I'm unthankful for the foundation. I'm so thankful for the foundation. But as I got older, I started to really study the Scriptures. And what I found is that a lot of things I was handed as a kid as absolute fact. The Bible says this, that settles it. A lot of things that I was handed as fact, the Bible doesn't actually say, or the Bible doesn't actually settle. Or it's very nuanced, so there's a lot of gray area. I was so upset in my early 20s when I found out that the Bible was not nearly as clear-cut as I had been led to believe it was. So you start to study it, and you start to question some things. For instance, I'd always been taught when I grew up by all the literature I'd been handed as a kid that that evolution was a hoax, and that the Bible in Genesis 1 and 2 clearly says that it was created in 6 24-hour literal periods, and if you follow the genealogy, that the earth must be about 6,000 years old. And I went to college believing that that's probably the way that the world worked, only to find out that there's a whole other group of biblical scholarship out there that's actually far more vast than the version I was handed, that believes that the word yom, the Hebrew word for day in Genesis chapter 1, sorry, for you Bible nerds, I'm about to get real nerdy for just a second, and then for the rest of you, I'll be right back with you in a minute, okay? So I found out the word yom in Genesis chapter 1 can mean all kinds of things. It doesn't have to mean a 24-hour little period. It can mean a whole epic, it can mean 1,000 years. It can mean a whole era of human history. And I also found out that it's tough to take those genealogies very literally, and almost no scholar does it except in the very narrow tradition that I was raised in. Now, that doesn't make me angry for the way that I was handed that stuff. I just got older and I realized, some people see it this way, and some people see it that way, and the Scripture just isn't actually super clear on trying to wrestle with our 21st century scientific questions, because that's not the question it's interested in. So I got to a place where I'm like, no, I believe that science is probably really helpful in determining the age of the earth and how things evolved over time, but I also believe, because I believe the Scripture is clear, that God is the genesis of it all, and that He's the creator. But here's what will start to happen. This is what happened to me. When you start questioning those old beliefs, or you start thinking about them a little differently, you will necessarily become a threat to those who still hold to the old way of thinking about it. those people who are most threatened by your new belief are the ones who are most insecure about their old one. Does that make sense? So they were already a little shaky on it, perhaps. But then when you came along and was like, I'm not sure that I see it that way anymore. Well, your lack of certainty felt like a threat to theirs. By the way, you see this at every level. When you start to change anything, people see it as a threat. They don't mean to. It's just not really their fault. They can't help it. For instance, you decide to go on a diet, okay? And you go to lunch with 4 or 5 friends, and they all order the chicken fried, chick, okay? Whatever they order. And it's just batter all over the table. And you order like a kale salad with dressing on the side, okay? And your friends look at you and they're like, what are we doing here, man? Like, what is this? Like, oh, I decided to start eating healthier this year. No, that's all you wanted to say. I'm just trying to eat healthier here. But what you actually said was, I'm eating healthier because you're all eating terribly and you're probably going to die early. Okay, that's what they heard you say. Not what you said, but that's what they heard you say. And your healthy choices now feel like a threat to their less healthy choices. Are you with me? Or let's say that you watch a TV show with a friend of yours, and you guys have been watching the same show for a while now, okay? Let's say that you watched all 42 seasons of The Walking Dead. And around season 39, you're like, I'm not sure this show is still good anymore. And so you stopped watching it, okay? You should have made that decision 10 seasons earlier, but you stopped at 39, okay? All right. And so then they're like, all right, we're going to get together for the season 40 premiere of Walking Dead. And you're like, I'm not really into that show anymore. What's wrong, man? Are we not friends? Our whole friendship was based on the idea that we watched The Walking Dead. So you're like, what is happening here, right? Like you just decided to check out, not a big deal for you, but it feels like a big deal for them. Because your new way of seeing things, living things, believing things feels like a threat to their old way of thinking it. Look, if you start to have your beliefs challenged about anything, about Scripture, about Christianity, about the way that you think about politics, about the way that you think about even your favorite sports team, your newfound belief or your even questioning of the old one will start to feel like a threat to those who are least secure in the old belief system, which means sometimes those people will lash out at you. They will call you horrible names. They will send emails tearing you down. They will write nasty things on social media about you. I have a friend who's experienced all these things. I'm just, postulating. So you just need to know that going into it. And yet, the way down is the way up. And while it feels like at the time, like it's endless and it's, the relationships have been frazzled and like it's never going to be good, it gets better. The Apostle Paul says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He's talking about this thorn in his side, and scholars disagree about exactly what this was. He's not clear about what it is, but it's something he was struggling with. We don't know if it was a sin issue he was struggling with or if it was maybe a physical ailment he was struggling with. But either way, he asked God to take it from him because he was tired of wrestling with it. He was tired of the struggle. But God didn't take it away. And so in 2 Corinthians 12:8, he writes this, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. And each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Order, disorder, reorder. And when you start to suffer, or you start to question old beliefs, or you feel betrayed, or you experience tragedy, your life will be thrown into disorder. You will be tossed off the first mountain, and you will be sitting there in the valley trying to determine what your way forward is. It will be easy to feel sorry for yourself and to ask why this is happening to you and not somebody else, and why this unfairness has befallen you and not someone else. Of course, that'll all be natural, and frankly, if you start by asking those questions, that's fully understandable. But at some point, you'll have to decide whether you're going to stay there in the muck and the mire and the self-pity, or whether you're going to pick up your cross and follow after Jesus, who himself challenged the beliefs of the religious system that he was raised in, who himself was betrayed by the people that he trusted most, who himself faced agony and suffering, physical laceration, and eventually murder because of the valley he was entering into, because of the disorder he was bringing. When I'm weak, then I am strong. Julian of Norwich, I like her because she lived a number of reasons. She was one of the mystics. She had these beautiful visions of Christ that she passed on. And the older I get, the more helpful I find some of these visions that were given to older saints. She was alive in the 15th century. And one of the things I love about her is that she could wear this exact outfit now and be in a modern day hip hop video, and it would totally work, actually. So, but Julian of Norwich writes this when she's talking about the way down being the way up. She says, "Our wounds are our glory. First the fall, and then the recovery from the fall, and both are the mercy of God." You will fall. You will suffer. You will make mistakes. And it will be easy to look back on those things in your life with disdain and horror and embarrassment. And yet, the way down is the way up. Spring doesn't come until after winter has passed. New stars are born out of the remnants of old exploded ones. There is no resurrection without death. And both your fall and your recovery from it, both are the mercy of God. Because you wouldn't be who you are today without both. And you won't be who you are 5 years or 10 years or more from now without more of both, I'm sorry to say. We are delivered more through our suffering than from our suffering. It's not that following after Jesus means God's going to take all the suffering away, but he can make it count for something, because Jesus is not a shield against suffering, but a pathway through it. Now, just as we wind down here, a couple thoughts for parents. If you're the parent of a child, you have walked through probably some amount of order and disorder and hopefully some reorder in your life. And we'll talk a lot about reorder next week. It will be not as heavy a sermon topic as we talked about today. But if you're a parent, you've walked through some of that, and you've taken the beliefs from your childhood, and you've synthesized them, and you've rethought them, and then you had children yourself, and you handed your kids, like you took all of your experience and all of your wisdom and all the things that mentors passed down to you and all of your experiences, and you packaged them up in a beautiful set of order and beliefs, and you handed them to your children, and you said, "Look what I did for you. I did all of this for you, and I want you to have a better foundation and starting place than I had. Here you go." And your children received that box, and they looked at it and they said, "Yeah, okay." They shook it a little bit to see what was inside. Sometimes they threw it in the recycle bin, or they left it sitting on the counter and walked away from it. And you're like, no. You don't understand how much went into this. Here, please take this. Please take this. Please understand that it's so helpful for you. So you are sitting there and you're thinking like, man, I have poured all of this into my kids, and they don't even see the wisdom, the value of it. They don't even understand. They are pushing back against the very carefully curated things that I handed them. And if that's the case for you, I say, good. Because they can't grow until they question everything you handed them. Now, if you're a parent, that doesn't feel good, which means you have some options. You can feel disrespected that they're questioning what you handed them. And in doing so, you'll probably lose influence with them. Or you can recognize this as a healthy part of growing older and pushing back, and choose to lean in with them and to be there for them should they choose to come bring you some questions or to include you in on their thought process or the conversation, and in doing so to keep influence with them, and therefore to continue to pour into them to whatever degree they'll allow you to do as they step into adulthood. So if you're a parent, I get that it's challenging to see your kids question so much of what you handed them. But my guess is you did the same to your parents. And one day, this is the awesome part, you'll get to see their kids do the same to them. And you'll be able to tell them, it's okay. It's a healthy part of growing up, and you can't get from the first mountain to the second without disorder. A couple thoughts for the wounded. Some of you are sitting here today and you have, maybe over the last few weeks or months or years, walked through a kind of hell that many people could not imagine. And if that's you, probably some of what we've talked about today has felt hard. It's just bringing stuff up in your mind. I want you to know that God loves you, and he's with you, and he's for you. And I also want to caution you against what can sometimes happen. None of us walk through woundedness alone and recover well by ourselves. We need other people pouring into our lives, and we need other people to encourage us. And so, it's one of the reasons that the church can be such a helpful place, because you're surrounded by people. I've heard people say they visit a church and they're like, I can't go there. Like, those people all have it together. Let me just tell you, as a pastor who talks to all these people, none of these people have it together. Least of all me, okay? Like, none of us do. We're here for each other. We're here to support one another. So sometimes you get really wounded and you start to tell people your story, and that's good. And then a lot of times those people will have empathy for you and compassion for you, and they will try to pour love and care into you, and that's good too. But sometimes we can get stuck at that point because the compassion we felt from other people feels so good that we can sometimes make the choice. Usually it's not a choice we make consciously, but sometimes we make the choice to sit in our woundedness for a very long time in order to continue to get compassion and empathy from others. And what we can become is something that psychologists call a wound-identified person, where you are now, a core part of your identity is the wound you received, maybe from a tragedy in your life, a betrayal in your life, a rethinking of something in your life. And then it's very hard to ever find healing outside of that because your identity is now wrapped up in your pain. And so if your pain were to heal, your identity would change, and the ego hates change and loss. So maybe something happened to you years ago, and the people closest to you know that you are still primarily identified by that thing. Here's what I want to say. That thing will always, always shape you. It will always have, it's part of the makeup of who you are. But that thing, horrible as it might be, does not define you. Don't let it. Don't keep nailing yourself to that cross every day. Pick the cross up and follow Jesus. We must fall apart in order to find ourselves. I wish it were different, but the great spiritual teachers throughout all of Christian history have shown us that the way down is the way up. Which means if you're looking back over the last several years of your life and you're thinking through maybe a number of the tragedies or challenges or difficulties you faced, my hope is that there will be some part of you, and maybe not today, maybe this is something you work toward, that can agree with Julian of Norwich that both the suffering, the tragedy, the fall, and the resurrection from that fall, both the mercy of God. Not that God did it, not that God wished harm upon you, but that when you made your way through a fallen world, some of that fallenness rubbed off on your life. It is Jesus who was there to offer you a hand up, and to invite you to pick that cross up, that suffering up, and follow after him. It's all mercy. It all belongs. I'm going to ask everybody to bow their heads and close their eyes for just a moment. And I want to pray for you. So I'm not going to have you stand up. I'm not going to have you come forward. I'm certainly not going to embarrass you this morning. I just want to know who to pray for. I just wanted to conclude my time this morning with a prayer. And so with every head bowed and every eye closed, there's no one looking around right now. Like, if you would just be willing to say, Josh, right now I am going through a season of anxiety or tragedy or stress or struggling with beliefs. Like, would you pray for me? Like, if that's you, would you just slip your hand up and slip it right back down? Josh, would you pray for me? Yep, I see that all over the room. Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much. You can slip your hand back down. Anybody else, though? Anybody else? Like, yep, that's me too. Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you. Heavenly Father, none of us long for suffering. We don't long for anxiety. We don't long, Lord, for a challenge to the way that we see the world or our beliefs. Like, it's not, we don't go seeking that stuff, but it finds us anyway. So for each hand that was raised this morning, I lift them up, and whatever they are facing and whatever their suffering is, God, may you give them the strength and the wisdom to acknowledge it, to understand it, and also over time to pick it up as their cross and to follow after Jesus. That's how we become his disciple. That's how we become more like him. And God, I just pray if it's any great comfort that probably a third or more of the people in this room were willing to raise their hand and say, that's me right now. And God, I know that knowledge doesn't fix our problems, Lord, but it lets us know we are not alone. And Lord, thank you for showing us the ultimate version of knowing we're not alone by wrapping yourself, clothing yourself in flesh and blood and coming and dwelling amongst us to suffer as we suffer, to live as we must live, and to show us a way forward as we take all of our suffering, we pick it up, and we follow after you. Help us be grateful for your mercy. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.